Today, we become legends.
Smite 2 is one of the most pristine examples of first impressions mattering that we've ever seen. When the game was originally revealed, a lot of hype was created around it as the sequel to carry on the legacy of the only long-term successful third-person MOBA on the market. But when we actually got our hands on the game in May this year, it was not what most people expected. It was made clear early on that the game was going to be launching as a closed alpha to gather feedback from its most dedicated players leading up to a free-to-play release much later on. But I don't think anyone expected how genuinely bad the game would turn out to be in that original alpha build. It clearly had promise, taking some elements from other successful MOBAs like active items and split scaling while retaining the core of what made Smite successful in the first place, but built from the ground up in a new engine. However, the game had only been worked on for just over a year at that point with a minimal dev team, and it really showed. It was buggy even for an alpha, the art direction was rough even for an alpha, the amount of content available was pitiful even for an alpha, and the worst part was that you had to pay to playtest this experience that was really just not even close to a playable game at that point. For the most hardcore Smite fans and or those who saw the game's potential in the future, this wasn't really an issue. We were willing to look past the game's current flaws at the time to see the promise of what it could become. It was an alpha after all, and the devs do deserve some leeway as this wasn't even meant to be close to a final product. The goal was to gather feedback and build the game alongside the community for long-term success, which I think they have done quite well. The game was pretty hyped when it originally launched into alpha, reaching peak player numbers higher than Smite 1, which is a refined experience with over a decade of development, and most importantly, is free to play. The fact that Smite 2 exceeded Smite 1's player counts while being locked behind a paywall and a test client is nothing short of impressive, and the game was the #1 top-selling game on Steam for a couple of weeks around the alpha launch window. However, that hype died quicker than the latest meme that takes over the internet. In the initial alpha weekend test, the game reached approximately 15,000 concurrent players on Steam. The next test about a month later reached only 6,000, another month later just over 2,000. These were only brief weekend tests where the game was available for a couple of days, then shut off for a month, but the game went into 24/7 alpha around 3 months after initially launching to a decent reception, reaching 12,000 players on Steam as people flooded back to see if the game had improved since the terrible alpha weekends. It didn't quite reach the same heights as the very first alpha test when hype was massive, but this was still more players than Smite 1 was pulling at this point, despite the latter game being free to play and a much more refined experience. However, the 24/7 launch followed the exact same trajectory as the alpha weekends. The game was not even close to ready for a mainstream release yet, and most of the players that came back to check in on the game for the 24/7 launch had left within a month. The game plummeted from 15,000 concurrent players in late August to just over 2,000 players in late September, where it has basically remained ever since. Sometimes pulling a bit more than 2,000 after big updates, and sometimes a bit less during content droughts, but mostly just hovering around 2,000. The game experienced an almost 90% loss in concurrent Steam players in just over a month. Also, I'll mention it here because I always see this kind of comment. Yes, this is only concurrent Steam players. This doesn't mean only 2,000 people play the game actively. You can usually at least 10x the peak concurrent number if you want an estimate of total daily players. And yes, this is just Steam as well. Smite 2 is also on consoles, and a significant portion of the player base, maybe even the majority, play the game on those platforms. The only reason I use concurrent Steam players is because it's the only source of readily available consistent data about the player count of games, and you can generally extrapolate trends in Steam data to consoles as well. That tangent aside though, the game basically stabilized around 2,000 concurrent players and continued for about 3 or 4 months since the player base tanked, despite the development on the game dramatically speeding up and the game becoming much more complete in that time. It's hard to overstate how much work has been done on the game in just 3 to 4 months, but comparing those early alpha tests to how the game is now is a night and day difference. And with the game approaching a free-to-play beta launch in January, perhaps it will have a chance to redeem those first impressions. I personally have seen a lot of people on Twitter, Reddit, Discord, Twitch chat, and my YouTube comments who say things about the game that are objectively no longer true, but since they haven't actually tuned into the news or played the game recently, they still assume the game is as terrible and unfinished as it was in the first ever alpha test. Is there still work to be done on the game? Absolutely. Games like this are never finished, and Smite 2 is still lacking quite a lot of features and content that Smite 1 has had for years. But for every person I see still active in the community that is misinformed on the state of the game due to not playing it in months, there's probably 10 more who have checked out completely and no longer follow the game in any capacity, therefore you never see them on Reddit or in my YouTube comments or in Twitch chat, because of those awful first impressions that they got. Getting those players back will be crucial to Smite 2's long-term success, as the current player counts are likely unsustainable. Don't get it twisted, there are plenty of other factors that are currently holding Smite 2 back. Having the previous game still available is splitting the player base, for example. There's a lot of competition from games like Deadlock and Marvel Rivals at the moment that make it hard for a game like Smite 2 that's still in early alpha phases to retain players. The game is currently still buy to play as well, with players needing to spend minimum $30 for access, which doesn't help either. But in terms of the core game of Smite 2, it's come a long way and is already more fun than its predecessor in my opinion, but those first impressions people got from the very early alpha tests have driven away a lot of players. As mentioned before, Smite 2 was a top selling game on Steam for a few weeks and reached player counts around 7 to 8 times higher than it achieves now. So it's not just an issue of people refusing to pay for access. Many people have already bought it, they just aren't playing. It's also not just an issue of competition from games like Marvel Rivals and Deadlock, or just an issue of splitting the player base with its predecessor, Smite 1. If those things were the case, then a lot of those initial players that bought into the game would have returned, though sadly I think many tuned out of Smite entirely after seeing how rough those early alpha tests were. To be clear, my personal stance is that they should have tried to delay the game at least a little while before revealing it, gathering feedback internally and from ambassadors, basically the content creators and pro players that sign an NDA to get an early look at what's coming and provide feedback. It would have been a slower process, as the wide-scale feedback achieved by an open alpha will be far more useful than just a handful of insiders. But I do think releasing the game in a slightly more complete state would have helped alleviate that initial gut punch that was the early alpha weekends, as it clearly has turned a lot of people away from the game, and getting them back will be extremely difficult. Does delaying the game come with its own set of issues like less feedback, slower development, weaker cash flow, and others? Absolutely, but I think the game only being in development for about a year with a small team when they revealed it was too soon. Building a game that the core community wants and is happy with is incredibly important, and having wide-scale feedback is the best way to do that. But if it comes at the cost of alienating a lot of your core audience with an initial reveal that was underwhelming at best, is a heavy price to pay for the potential for long-term future success. To put a more positive spin on things though, the game itself is getting better at an astonishing pace, and I already think the core game is better than its predecessor with far more future potential. And with the game approaching its free-to-play launch, the team are likely to ramp up marketing for the game, which could reach some of those players that completely tuned out over 6 months ago and get them to try the game again, because I truly believe they will find a radically different and far superior experience to what they tried in those early alpha weekends. I don't think those players that tuned out early on in the game's development are completely lost. It will be hard to get them back, and of course the game will be in a much healthier state if they never left, but we saw firsthand with the launch of 24/7 Alpha that the game can at the very least get people to come back and try it. Those initial alpha weekends saw basically a 90% drop in players, but when 24/7 Alpha launched, Smite 2 almost reclaimed its prior highs in terms of players, reaching 12,000 compared to 15,000 on the initial launch. Sure, those players didn't stick around and the game once again experienced a 90% drop in players, and one can definitely argue that will just happen again with the free-to-play launch, but I do think the game is in a very different state now than it was back at 24/7 launch. The game itself has far more content and is a much more fun experience in my opinion, and this will be the free-to-play launch of the game, so they're not just aiming to get back all the players that bought the alpha and tuned out, they're also looking to get a fresh set of players in that either follow Smite but are waiting so they don't have to pay to try out the game, as well as brand new players that maybe never even played Smite 1, but will be willing to give Smite 2 a try once it's free. And if the game can get the players back, I think there's a much higher chance of them sticking around this time than there was in the early alpha weekends or the 24/7 launch, due to the game itself being much more complete and a better experience now. Only time will tell though. Thanks for watching.